Right. Let's talk a little bit about woke capitalism. Is it maybe in retreat, perhaps? I mean, there's been a few stories in the past couple of weeks. Unilever, the head of Unilever, this mega conglomerate which owns brands doing everything from, ice cream to soap. They've said that, well, not our brands don't need to have a social message anymore.
Which is a really bizarre thing, isn't it? Because really what they're saying is mayonnaise should just be about mayonnaise. The idea that mayonnaise or soap, ever did have a social message in the first place, that somebody saw fit to look at a bottle of Hellmann's mayonnaise and think, well, what's the social message that this mayonnaise is trying to convey?
It better be anti-racist.
Exactly. It's a bit too white. No, sorry. Silly now. But yeah, I think that you're right. There has been some pushback. We've seen a number of, particularly around advertising and marketing. Victoria's Secret have gone back over to skinny models, thinking this might help boost the profits back up. I think what's also interesting in the wake of Black Lives Matter chapters in the US coming out actually quite crudely in the past couple of weeks in support of Hamas, making some really quite crude statements. You've seen some of these companies that have been very pro Black Lives Matter very quietly dropping these statements of support from their websites. And I think there's just, particularly from off the back of the Bud Light boycott, there's been a bit more of an awareness that maybe if you are wanting to make a profit, overt woke messaging is not the way to go. But I'm wary about too much of a celebration of this, because I do think that the underlying principles of woke capitalism are about more than just marketing. It's not. I think it was always a mistake to think that, capitalists sat there kind of read into some claw thinking, really we're about making money, but we'll just pretend that we're interested in this social message so that we can sell a few more, jars of mayonnaise off the back of it. I think it was always about a bit more than that. And I think that bit more is going to survive a change in marketing and advertising strategy.
Well, I think companies are realising that this is a pointless minefield. We're talking on the day that M&S have brought out their new Christmas advert, which has already caused uproar. But part of the uproar was because a paper hat that one of the participants throws into the fire happens to be in the colours of the Palestinian flag.
Christmas colours. It's
Christmas,
worth pointing out.
And so then
it ended up being arranged in the order.
And the advert was filmed in July.
Yeah, so this is it. But then companies have to come out and try and explain themselves. And so just imagine working for an advertiser and trying to think all the possible impacts, that all the possible messages that could be read into your adverts. I think there does come a point where they think this is broadly not worth it. It's also worth mentioning that we've had one of the first prosecutions for a Black Lives Matter activist prosecuted for fraud in this country this week. So just spent around £60,000 of raised cash for BLM on herself. So there is always the risk that the causes you end up signing up to in time turn out, and especially when these causes appeared to come out of nowhere. I mean, it's important to remember that Black Lives Matter was assembled quite quickly in response to events and suddenly had this enormous corporate backing. Well, that is coming home to roost for companies now. But I think Joanna's right that we have to keep an eye on the underlying decision-making behind businesses and how they operate rather than focusing on the marketing, because, as I say, marketing can be interpreted in any number of different ways, but you can be sure that the boardrooms, the people who work there, the people coming into the staffing of these companies are still woke, still very much a part of that ideology, and will be for a long time.
I think the point is that almost even if they're not individually woke, this kind of woke ideology has become the way that capitalism regulates itself. I mean, it generates acres of paperwork where people have to submit to their companies have to submit to their boards of directors kind of charts detailing the diversity of the staff, the gender pay gap, the ethnicity pay gap, and kind of gathering all this data around environmental, social governance, around net zero, around the diversity of the workforce, around the unconscious bias training sessions that staff members have been on. This kind of provides the way that companies grade and regulate and relate to each other, relate to their staff members. It provides the way in which workers are disciplined. I mean, again, you go back kind of to when I first started having a Saturday job. The way you were disciplined was you'd have a little kind of clocking on card that you stamped, and it registered the time you arrived at work and the time that you left work. And it was very kind of clear, really, what you were selling was your labour for a certain number of hours. Now, with unconscious bias training, it almost feels as if what you're selling is your soul, quite literally. It's your thoughts, it's your unconscious that the bosses have control over and have access to. And I think this kind of equality, diversity, inclusion, environmental, social governance agenda, it's a very useful tool for the kind of capitalist class, if you like, to regulate themselves, relate to each other, and I think most importantly, to be able to discipline the workforce.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's worth thinking as well about the Nigel Farage scandal, because that all went on behind closed doors. They were actually at pains to deny that they had debanked him at first. And yet, we've seen all these messages come out about various staff members saying, that they were they'd like to, see him out of the country, that, his views are odious and things like that. So, yeah, I mean, look, this is kind of what Joanna's saying, right? This is very much an internal thing. It's not just about parading virtue to potential customers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also think, as we're seeing, the employment tribunal is actually a really interesting forum for these disputes to be worked out, because quite often we've seen cases recently where people have been speaking up against what they perceive to be a kind of woke orthodoxy within their workplaces, particularly around gender. So people expressing particular beliefs around there being two genders have found themselves in hot water with their employers. That's ended up in the employment tribunal. And what we're seeing is that I think the tide is shifting on in terms of the law. The employment tribunal is more willing to protect those kinds of beliefs from discipline from an employer. But really, the cases aren't the point. The point is that the rise of these cases reflects a culture within workplaces where there is this accepted morality. Yeah. And I think people feel that up and down the country. They feel as though where they work, there is only one way of thinking about particular topics, whether that be gender. I assume at the moment it also relating to Israel and Palestine. I think that it would be very hard in a lot of contemporary workplaces to give a full-throated support to Israel at a time like this, precisely because of these kinds of policies. And that's where kind of the cross between wokeism and cancel culture can really stifle people and really make people believe that they're alone within their workplaces. And that is how I think these things come to fester within businesses and with organizations more broadly.
I think the transcript of the emails and text messages that were exchanged behind the scenes relating to Nigel Farage is really interesting to tie in with what we've just been talking about in relation to the COVID inquiry and how kind of Brexit is, that's the urge you see in the KCs. They seem to want to point the finger at Brexit, at populism more broadly, and the Boris Johnson kind of get Brexit done government. And it's almost as if you see with both those instances how we are labouring under a political class that is just still not over Brexit. Yeah. Is using every opportunity it can to get one over on people who backed that kind of populist revolt of 2016.